Last week, we watched as the rebels of Israel were annihilated by two means. Fire coming from the Lord to destroy those 250 rebel leaders in Korah. And the main instigator of that rebellion was Korah. And the second means was an earthquake that opened up, it split huge in the earth underneath those tents, and Datan and Abiram and all those followers just plunged into it. Now on the surface, the rebellion was about a group of men who wanted Moses and Aaron's jobs. Underneath it all was the rebels' belief that neither a mediator nor a high priest was needed to represent the people to God. And folks, there is the stumbling block that the entire human population faces right up until today. That's it. Moses and Aaron were the point of argument then, and our combined mediator and high priest Yeshua is the point of that argument now. How many spiritual people say there's no need for a mediator? They can and they have earned the right to be in God's presence. Usually they verbalize this by saying that I'm a good person. I've lived a good life. See, some years ago I went on a number of home visitations with this wonderful assistant pastor back in the days when I lived down in the Florida Keys. And I had a first-hand look at this stumbling block in action. And I would say of the many homes that we visited and the many people we shared the gospel with, only the tiniest fraction denied that there was a God. Yet when they were asked if they thought they would go to heaven, the majority of those who said they believed in God said, yes, they did think they were going to heaven. Their reason? I've done more good things than bad things. And a few of these people listened to what we had to say and accepted they needed a Savior and a mediator, and his name is Yeshua. But most insisted they didn't need a Savior. They could do it themselves. This is exactly what Korah, Datan, and Abiram and all of their rebellious followers were declaring. We can do it ourselves. We can do it our way. We're good people. We can declare what is holy. We don't need Moses. We don't need Aaron. And then when God destroyed those rebels, many of the people of Israel, friends and relatives of the now deceased, blamed Moses and Aaron. And they decided that Moses and Aaron had caused these deaths, when in fact they had actually pled to God for mercy for these rebels. And then Moses and Aaron were thought to have caused the fire and the earthquake by manipulating God to do it for them. So although the terrifying demonstration of divine wrath had indeed destroyed many rebels, the rebellious mindset of Israel, well, that remained intact. God was about to spring into action again. Open your Bibles to Numbers 17. We're going to start at verse 9. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, that's page 169. Numbers 17, we're going to start at verse 9. Adonai said to Moses, get away from this assembly. I'm going to destroy them at once. But they fell on their faces. Moses said to Aaron, take your fire pan, put fire in it from the altar, and lay incense on it, and hurry with it to the assembly to make atonement for them, because anger has gone out from Adonai, and the plague's already begun. Aaron took it, as Moses had said, and he ran into the middle of the assembly. And there the plague had already begun among the people, but he added the incense and made atonement for the people. And he stood between the dead and the living, and the plague was stopped. And those dying from the plague numbered 14,700, besides those who died in the Korah incident. Aaron returned to Moses at the entrance to the tent of meeting, and the plague was stopped. And Adonai said to Moses, speak to the people of Israel and take from them staffs, one for each ancestral tribe, from each leader of a tribe 12 staffs, and write each man's name on a staff. Write Aaron's name on the staff of Levi, for each tribe's leader is to have one staff. Put them in the tent of meeting in front of the testimony where I'll meet with you. The staff of the man I'm going to choose will sprout buds, and in this way I'll put a stop to the complaints the people of Israel keep making against you. And Moses spoke to the people of Israel, and all their leaders gave them staffs, one for each leader, according to their ancestral tribes, 12 staffs. And Aaron's staff was among their staffs. And Moses put the staff before Adonai in the tent of testimony. And the next day Moses went into the tent of the testimony, and there he saw that Aaron's staff for the house of Levi had budded. It had sprouted not only buds, but flowers and ripe almonds as well. Moses brought out all the staffs from Adonai to all the people of Israel, and they looked, and each man took back his staff. Adonai said to Moses, return Aaron's staff to its place in front of the testimony. It's to be kept there as a sign to these rebels, so that they stop grumbling against me and thus not die. Moses did this. He did as Adonai had ordered him. But the people of Israel said to Moses, oh no, we're dead men, lost, we're all lost. Whenever anyone approaches the tabernacle of Adonai, he dies. Will we all perish? A plague of some sorts breaks out among the people of Israel. What exactly this plague is, we don't know. It was of divine source, and people started immediately dying. Just as fire pans, censers, were the instruments used to foment this rebellion, a fire pan is the instrument used to atone for the people's sin against God. Aaron takes coals from the brazen altar, puts them on his fire pan. He places incense on top of it and literally runs to the midst of the people to make atonement for their foolish rebellion. But for 14,700 Israelites, it was already too late. And since biblical population counts invariably only include males, the total number, counting females and children, was likely closer to 50,000 souls that had perished in what must have been minutes. Now, as high priest, Aaron was forbidden to come into contact with the dead. So apparently he carefully avoided all those dead bodies as he kind of worked his way to stand in between the dead and the living. However, his close proximity to so much death would have meant he became defiled. Now recall that at the beginning of chapter 17, Eleazar, the son of Aaron, had been the one chosen to sift through all those human remains of those who brought unauthorized fire to the tabernacle and presented it to God in order that he could retrieve all those fire pans. For what reason? They had contracted holiness. Now, while touching dead bodies defiled priests, they were not entirely prohibited from coming into contact with the dead. The high priest was forbidden altogether from touching a corpse. This is why Eleazar had to do it. But the seriousness of the situation within the community of Israel, being in rebellion and under the curse of a plague, required Aaron himself as high priest to make the atonement for the community. And so, where danger to life is involved, the defilement he suffered in order to save countless thousands of Hebrew lives was necessary. And at the end of verse 14, the Torah lays the blame on this whole thing directly upon the shoulders of Korah. Now please note that Satan, while active on earth since the time of Adam and Eve, is not blamed here, as we of the church tend to do a little too much. It's not that Satan is blameless or harmless. It's that we're not somehow helpless against Satan's temptations. We can resist the devil. We can. We can choose to obey the Lord, not to succumb to Lucifer's direction. What Korah felt subject to was his own evil inclination. And that is what most of us do most of the time when we sin against Jehovah. Take note, if one man can lead thousands astray, as did Korah, how easy it is for one man to lead another man, or maybe his wife, or his children away from the Lord. Korah was the anti-mediator. He was the anti-Moses. And what a terrible fate awaits that man who deceives and rebels, and on his account, others are led into rebellion, perhaps even into eternal destruction. In verse 15, we're told that Aaron's offering of incense worked. God relented, and the plague ended as quickly as it began. But the issue that was at the heart of all this rebellion was obviously still not settled. And that issue was, who shall be God's set-apart servants? The Levites or some other group of Hebrews? The people needed further persuasion. So yet another test is devised, the test of the sticks or the staffs. Now the possessor of the staff was the possessor of tribal leadership and authority. Therefore, there was only one official stick or staff per tribe, and the tribal prince had control over it. The Hebrew word for stick or rod or staff is mate. That same exact word, mate, is used to mean tribe. So we see this close connection between a tribe and its staff, and that there is a great significance in the test that is to come, and that it will use the tribal mate to represent each mate. You see the connection here. The tribe and its staff. Quite literally, each tribe is going to be set before the Lord for him to indicate which one he's going to choose to represent and serve him. Of course, what we can all understand in hindsight is that what was about to occur was not a decision, it was an affirmation of what had already been ordained. So each tribal prince presents his staff to Moses with the tribe's name engraved upon it. Then Aaron presents his staff, representing the tribe of Levi, a total of 13 staffs. 13 tribes are represented. The Lord says he's going to use these staffs as a means of demonstrating once and for all who his anointed servants are. The staffs are then placed inside the Holy of Holies before the Ark of the Covenant that holds those stone tablets of the Ten Commandments. Now the reason is that it is above the Ark where the Lord's presence is said to dwell. So the symbolism is that the 12 tribes plus Levi are presenting themselves to God for his will to be displayed. And the way the Lord's going to show his will is by causing the mate, the tribal staff of the tribe he chooses to be his servants, to sprout. Of course, that's quite a miracle. For what is happening is that something that is long dead, that dried and hardened staff, is going to be made alive. The staffs were left overnight. Following morning, Moses enters the tent of the sanctuary, and he finds Aaron's staff, representing the tribe of Levi, in bloom. It had not only sprouted, it had produced blossoms. It even had fully formed almonds on it. Moses took all the staffs outside of the tent, asked each tribal leader to come and identify his own staff, and in the process verified it was Aaron's staff that had budded. Game over. Now, it's interesting to see various connections emerge from what went on with Aaron's budding staff and some earlier ordinances of God. The Hebrew word for bud or blossom is tzitz. Tzitz. It's the same root as used for the word we studied only a couple chapters earlier, tzitzit, which indicated tassels, fringe. Even more, tzitz is precisely the same Hebrew word used for that gold-plated headband that was attached to the front of the high priest's mitre. It was this ritual headpiece. So this gold plate, this tzitz, had the words, Holy to Yehovah, written on it. So the buds on the staff, the high priest's golden headplate, and the tassels worn on the corners of all Israelites' garments are all interrelated. In varying degrees, they all represent some aspect of a divinely declared holiness. Now notice as well that the design of the menorah, that holy candelabra of the tabernacle, incorporated almond blossoms, tzitz, in its hammered gold construction. There's been a lot of speculation as to why almonds, why almond blossoms. The only real answers, if they are correct, come from Hebrew tradition. And it is that the almond is said to be the first tree to blossom in the winter. It's the first to come alive after a season of death or dormancy. Further, an almond bears a white blossom, and white represents purity and holiness and even God himself. Tribal leaders finally recognize and at least to some degree accept the position of the Levites and now serving people. But as people do, we also tend to go off the deep end. And we make assumptions that aren't true. And in verse 27, we see the Israelites doing just that. They now recognize the gravity of their questioning God and their rebellion against Moses and Aaron and the priesthood in general. And having witnessed the fire incinerate 250 of their top leaders, the earth open up and swallow whole blocks of tents and people and all of their possessions, and finally a plague erupt that killed thousands. In a matter of minutes, perhaps, the Israelites are too terrified to even come near the wilderness tabernacle. They've seen with their own eyes that any unauthorized person who dares to venture near to the holy tent gets destroyed. Yet how are they going to carry out God's ordained sacrifices in order to atone for their sin or to simply be obedient to him if they can't come to the tabernacle where the brazen altar is? Now obviously, that's not what God was teaching here. But the first step of the lesson has been achieved. Oh yeah, the people now fear God. And now they believe it's a bad idea to challenge the authority of his earthly agents, Moses and Aaron. Well, let's move on to the concluding chapter of this three-chapter block, chapter 18, Numbers 18. Page 169 if you have a complete Jewish Bible. Adonai said to Aaron, you, your sons, and your father's family line will be responsible for anything that goes wrong in this sanctuary. You and your sons will be responsible for anything wrong in your service as Kohanim, as priests. But you are to bring your kinsmen, the tribe of Levi, along with yourselves to work together with you and help you. You and your sons with you, when you are there before the tent of meeting. They are to be at your disposal to perform all kinds of tasks related to the tent. Only they are not to come near the holy furnishings or the altar so that neither they nor you will die. They will work together with you in your duties related to the tent of meeting, whatever the service in the tent may be, but an unauthorized person is not to come near you. You will take charge of all the holy things and the altar so that there will no longer be anger against the people of Israel. I myself have taken your kinsmen, the Levites, from among the people of Israel. They have been given as a gift to Adonai for you, so that you can perform the service in the tent of meeting. You and your sons with you will exercise your prerogatives and duties as priests in regard to everything having to do with the altar and within the curtain. I entrust the service required of Kohanim, priests, to you. The unauthorized person who tries to perform it is to be put to death. And Adonai said to Aaron, I myself have put you in charge of the contributions given to me. Everything consecrated by the people of Israel I have given and set aside for you and for your sons. This is a perpetual law. Here's what is to be yours of the especially holy things taken from the fire. every offering they make. That is, every grain offering, sin offering, and guilt offering of theirs that they turn over to me will be especially holy for you and your sons. You are to eat it in an especially holy place. Every male may eat it. It will be set apart for you. Also, yours is the contribution the people of Israel give in the form of wave offerings. I have given these to you, your sons and your daughters with you. This is a perpetual law. Everyone in your family who is clean may eat it. All the best of the olive oil and the wine and the grain and the first portion of what they give to Adonai I have given to you. The first produce to turn right of all that is in their land, which they bring to Adonai, is to be yours. Every clean person in your family may eat it. Everything in Israel which has been consecrated unconditionally is to be yours. Everything that comes first out of the womb of all living things which they offer to Adonai, whether human or animal, will be yours. However, the firstborn of a human being you must redeem, and the firstborn of an unclean beast you are to redeem. The sum to be paid for redeeming anyone a month old or over is to be 5 shekels of silver, as you value it, using the sanctuary shekel. But the firstborn of an ox, sheep, or goat you are not to redeem. They are holy. So you are to splash their blood against the altar and make their fat go up in smoke as an offering made by fire, as fragrant aroma for Adonai. Their meat will be yours, like the breast that is waved in the right thigh. They will be yours. All the contributions of holy things which the people of Israel offer to Adonai I have given to you, your sons and your daughters with you. This is a perpetual law and eternal covenant of salt before Adonai for you and your descendants with you. Adonai said to Aaron, you are not to have any inheritance or portion in their land. I am your portion and inheritance among the people of Israel. And to the descendants of Levi, I have given the entire tenth of the produce collected in Israel. It is their inheritance and payment for the service they render in the tent of meeting. From now on, the people of Israel are not to approach the tent of meeting so that they will not bear the consequences of their sin and die. Only the Levites are to perform service in the tent of meeting, and they will be responsible for whatever they do wrong. This is to be a permanent regulation through all your generations. They are to have no inheritance among the people of Israel, because I have given to the Levites as their inheritance the tenths of the produce, which the people of Israel set aside as a gift for Adonai. This is why I have said to them that they are to have no inheritance among the people of Israel. Adonai said to Moses, tell the Levites, when you take from the people of Israel the tenth of the produce which I have given you from them as your inheritance, you are to set aside from it a gift for Adonai, 1/10 of the tenth. The gift you set aside will be accounted to you as if it were grain from the threshing floor, grape juice from the wine vat. In this way, you will set aside a gift for Adonai from all your tenths that you receive from the people of Israel. And from these tenths, you are to give to Aaron the priest the gift set aside for Adonai. From everything given to you, you are to set aside all that is due Adonai, the best part of it, its holy portion. Therefore, you are to tell them, when you set aside from its best part, it will be accounted to the Levites as if it were grain from the threshing floor and grape juice from the wine vat. You may eat it anywhere, you and your households, because it is your payment in return for your service in the tent of meeting. Moreover, because you will have set aside from it its best parts, you will not be committing any sin because of it, for you are not to profane the holy things of the people of Israel, or you will die. The Lord's answer to the fear of the Israelite general population to come near the tabernacle is that it's all on the tribe of Levi to bear the guilt if an unauthorized person encroaches on the sacred tabernacle. It's up to the tribe of Levi to guard the wilderness tabernacle, ensure that the only people who are allowed to be there and allowed to perform certain rituals in it get in. So if someone gets by them by accident, on purpose, it doesn't matter. It is the responsible Levite who bears the guilt and the punishment. Further, it is the regular priest's responsibility to keep an eye on the regular Levites, the non-priest part of the tribe. To make sure that they do only what God has authorized them to do within the sanctuary area and no more. So if a Levite fouls up and accidentally or carelessly touches a sacred ritual object, which is a no-no, then it is the priests as the supervisors who are going to bear the guilt. Right along with the man who did wrong. After all, the Levites ought to know better. Priests also monitor other priests. The priesthood had a hierarchy within it. It wasn't just the high priest at the top of the ladder and then all other priests as co-equals. There were higher and lower priests. In fact, in some of the ancient Hebrew documents, we'll find reference to the high priests. High priest plural. This didn't mean the high priest. While there was a couple of times, a couple of high priests at the same time, that's not what they're referring to. It's referring to the senior priests who were at the top end of the priest management structure. In the end, the purpose of the system is for the benefit of the people. Because when the people trespassed on God's holiness, His justice demanded that the nation of Israel receive His wrath. This entire organizational structure led to the creation of an army of Levite guards to guard the tabernacle. And they had the authority to kill. But in God's economy, that was actually an act of mercy, because it was designed to protect Israel as a whole from divine punishment. Later on in the New Testament, we're going to hear of the temple guard and their involvement with the arrest of Yeshua. The temple guard was composed of Levites, not Roman soldiers, as is sometimes erroneously reported. Okay. In verse 6, we're reminded of this all-important principle that not only is the tribe of Levi divided and separated away from Israel, but that these common Levites are divided and separated away from the Levite priests. And the purpose of the Levites is to serve the priests, not as house slaves, not as their personal servants, but as manual labor for all the needed tabernacle maintenance and transportation and guard duty, cleanup. And while almost all what follows about sacrifices and offerings has been given to us before, kind of scattered throughout the book of Leviticus, it's now repeated in a more systematic and orderly way. And it's done this way in response to the series of tragedies that have just occurred, among which are the refusal of the scouts who went into Canaan to lead the people into the promised land. The man gathering sticks on Sabbath, he was executed. Korah, leading many of the Hebrew leaders in rebellion, and thousands of Israelites were destroyed. And then this unnamed plague that was just brought upon Israelites who complained that it was not just for Moses and for Aaron to bring about judgment. Now, all of these things were caused essentially because the people and the leaders didn't submit to Moses and Aaron's leadership. And they didn't accept the special role of the priesthood and the set-apart nature of the tribe of Levi. Therefore, now that those who had led that rebellion, along with everybody who followed them, had been purged from Israel, and a proper awe of God and respect for His chosen leadership and institutions was established, the Lord would reiterate what He expected of the priesthood and what the people's response to the authority of the priesthood ought to be. So we get a list of those things, offered as sacrifices, tithes from the people that are to be given to the priests and Levites as their pay. Now, a lot of what's spoken here is intended to be instituted not immediately, but only after they finally conquered Canaan and they set up residence there. But the gist of it is that of the portion of the offerings to God that the priests are allowed to eat, the priests' families may also eat of it if they are ritually clean. And the whole idea here is that while the regular Israelites are expected to grow crops, raise sheep and goats and all that, the tribe of Levi is expected to serve the Lord in the form of ministering to the people. So in return, the people are to financially support the tribe of Levi. Now remember, when Israel enters the Promised Land, Levi is only to get 48 villages to live in. They don't get any sovereign territory of their own, so they really have little to no means to support themselves. We also find, interestingly enough, that priests are exempt from paying a tithe on what they receive as payment. However, the regular Levites are not. Whatever the regular Levites receive as their share of tithed produce and meat and money, they have to return a tenth of that to the priesthood as their tithe. And this is because in the end, the priests minister to the Levites just as they minister to the common Israelites. Further, while most of what is given to the priest in the form of food must actually be eaten on the tabernacle grounds because it's holy, once the Levites have given back to the priests the tenth, their tithe, of what they have received for pay, they can now remove the remaining portion of the food from the temple area and eat it anywhere. So the idea is the act of tithing for the Levite deholified the remaining portion of their pay. What had been holy, just as though it was common food, and is given a different status than when it was originally offered food that has been offered to the Lord, what was originally holy is de-holified because a tithe was paid on it. The holy status of the food was removed by means of tithing. Now understand, this is a beneficial thing for the Levites. Because if this process didn't happen, they would be in constant violation of removing and eating holy food outside of the holy tabernacle area. Further, they wouldn't have been able to feed their families with the same food. Now let's finish up today by discussing holiness for a few minutes, because too often modern believers have a little idea what holiness actually is. The New Testament asserts the idea of holiness, but it doesn't explain holiness. Fortunately, the Torah does. Typically, within the Christian church, holiness is seen primarily as some kind of pious behavior. We act extra special nice. We give more. We bow our heads and we clasp our hands in a certain way. We say, I love you and God bless you a lot. We pay our taxes honestly. We give our full tithe. And while our behavior is important, holiness is much more about our personal status and condition. It's a status that's bestowed upon us by God and by God alone. He sets up the rules and boundaries. He decides who and what is holy on his terms. Holiness and uncleanness, from the standpoint of the Torah, are closely connected. Because although they are nearly opposite in status, they behave in very similar manners. For one thing, both holiness and uncleanness are said to be contagious. More, both holiness and uncleanness can be dangerous. Therefore, the brazen altar, which carries a very high degree of holiness, infects, so to speak, whatever touches it with its holiness. The meat offered on the brazen altar, which itself is holy, transmits its holiness to the vessel it gets cooked in. So the metal pots have to be thoroughly cleaned after cooking sacrificial meat, and clay pots have to be destroyed because it's impossible to scour the holiness out of a porous pot. It's absorbed it. The danger here is inadvertent transfer of holiness from the altar to the meat, to the pot, and then to whatever is next cooked in it. After Aaron has finished his ritual duties and he takes off his high priest garments, he has to wash himself, or the holiness of the high priest garment that covered Aaron's skin is liable to be transmitted to the common garment that Aaron would now put on. Holiness is dangerous if acquired by someone who's not authorized to have it. Priests can't perform their duties if they are in a clean state, lest they touch a holy device, unless they're in a clean state, lest they touch a holy device, and then they defile it with their uncleanness. In our just finished series of these rebellion stories, we find unauthorized people, meaning people who God had not anointed with holiness, offering unauthorized incense in a holy place to a holy God. They're destroyed. Because first, they disobeyed and they encroached on holy ground. And second, because they acquired holiness due to their nearness to God that He had not authorized for them to have. But priests who are authorized holiness by Jehovah can offer incense in a holy place to a holy God safely. See, the principle is, whatever is holy cannot be used for a common purpose in a common place. Therefore, whatever is made holy must stay within the holy precinct of the tabernacle. Conversely, what is common cannot be offered to God, it can't be brought to a holy place, or it might acquire holiness, then it'll have to be destroyed because it was never meant to be holy. And when those fire pans of Korah, all of his cohorts, were presented to God in an unauthorized manner, guess what? They still acquired holiness because of their nearness to the Lord. So in that case, rather than having the fire pans destroyed, God chose to have those fire pans melted down, and they were formed into a protective lid for the altar as a sign, as a warning to Israel. And He permanently kept that holy metal inside the holy precinct. It never left again. The coals used for the fire pans, well, they had also contracted holiness. The solution here, however, was that the coals had to be scattered away from the tabernacle and not used at all for anything. They couldn't be used to start a new fire. They had to be done away with. Had those coals been used to start a new fire, the coals from that new fire would have contracted an unauthorized holiness. Listen to Ezekiel talk about holiness. Ezekiel 46:20. About which he said to me, this is the place where the priests will boil the guilt offerings and sin offerings and bake the grain offerings, and in this way they won't have to bring them into the outer courtyard and risk transmitting holiness to the people. Not everyone was created for holiness. Not everyone was created for the same degree of holiness. And those who were not created for holiness are entitled to it. And those who are entitled only to a certain level of holiness can't be allowed to accidentally get more. Holiness has to be protected and guarded. See, here's the thing. Holiness is really complex. It's a very serious matter. There are literally scores of references to the holiness of a believer in the New Testament. Yet for some reason, we prefer to take notice of the parts that sound nice and allegorize or spiritualize the rest of them away. Or just as problematic, we read the words, but we don't bother to find out what they mean. Romans 11:6. Now if the challah offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole loaf. And if the root is holy, so are its branches. Paul makes the assertion that if a piece of a batch of dough is holy, well, then the whole batch is too. And if the root of a tree is holy, then all the branches attached to that tree. Or if we read a little further off in Romans, branches that were grafted onto that tree, they all become holy. Well, that's all well and good, but by what God principle does a batch of dough and the branches of a tree become holy just because a bit of dough and the root of the tree is holy? Notice Paul doesn't even bother to explain his assertion. That's because the biggest portion of his audience was Jews. They understood the Torah principle that holiness and uncleanness can be transmitted by means of contact. They've lived with that all their lives. It was just an immutable spiritual law they'd all been raised with. Acts 7:33. Adonai said to him, "Take off your sandals because the place where you are standing is holy ground." This New Testament passage recalls Moses standing before the Lord at the burning bush. Moses is told to remove his sandals because he's standing on holy ground. Why? Is it because it's a sign of respect to remove your shoes when you're standing before the Lord? Maybe, but that's not the concern of this passage. No. The issue of removing the sandals is because the holiness of the holy ground Moses stood upon would have been transferred to Moses' sandals. And then that holiness would have been transmitted to wherever those sandals walked, wherever Moses walked. Zechariah 14:21. And every cooking pot in Jerusalem and in Judah will be holy to the Lord of hosts. And all who sacrifice will come and take of them and boil in them, and there will no longer be a Canaanite in the house of the Lord of hosts in that day. What in the world does that mean? It has to do with what happens when you cook sacrificial meat in a cooking pot. The pot becomes holy because of the transference of holiness to the pot from the holy meat. Then the pot has to be cleansed, or has to be broken, so that whatever else is cooked in the pot doesn't accidentally have holiness transmitted to it. But here, this verse from Zechariah is speaking of a time when holiness is universal among Israel. And every Israelite who uses that pot is entitled to holiness. So it's okay if that holiness is transmitted from that pot to other foods and from the foods to the person who eats it, because all the danger has been taken away. I hope you're beginning to get the picture. Holiness has a whole universe of aspects that we have known nothing about because we haven't studied the foundational part of God's Word. Therefore, we get some really skewed ideas of what seems to be difficult New Testament passages. The concept of transmissible holiness and uncleanness is totally behind the reason that Paul tells men not to join themselves to prostitutes. Why? Because holiness can be transmitted in joining together of a holy male to an unholy female, or vice versa. And just as important, because the uncleanness of the prostitute can defile the holy male. Then that uncleanness can defile God's holiness that's in him, especially if you're a believer. Plus, it violates the principle of shanet, the prohibition of illegal mixing. This even seems to hold true for married couples to some unexplained degree. Listen to this New Testament passage. 1 Corinthians 7:13. And a woman who has an unbelieving husband and he consents to live with her, let her not send her husband away. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife. And the unbelieving wife is sanctified through a believing husband. Because otherwise, your children are unclean, but now they're holy. Here's an example of one of those really difficult sayings of Paul. Sayings that even the Apostle Peter said, man, those things are hard to understand. Paul makes an assertion in this passage, and again, Paul never explains his principles. He just lays them out there. Which leads me to believe that there was some underlying and understood Torah principle that he was applying to this situation, but something that was also not understood outside of Hebrew culture. Paul was in Corinth, he was in a Gentile nation, and Gentiles had a really hard time ferreting out commonly known principles that are part of a Hebrew society because they're unknown in Gentile society. The bottom line and end point of this passage is that if an unbeliever marries a believer, and if two unbelievers marry, and later one becomes a believer, in either case, God accepts their marriage as legal in his eyes. So all children born from this union would be legitimate and not unclean mamzer, bastards. Thus, there is no legal requirement from God that that kind of a mixed marriage would be ended. The problem is, it'd be awfully easy for Paul to just say that this is the situation. That God sees the marriage of a believer and an unbeliever as legal. But he didn't. Instead, he invoked some understood principle, at least it was understood to him, as a means to explain it. And that principle was that the believing spouse united with the unbeliever conferred sanctification upon the unbeliever. Thus, for that reason, the marriage was legal, and the righteous believer wouldn't lose his righteousness before God because they were united in marriage to an unbeliever. But what biblical principle is at play under which the unbelieving husband is made holy by means of his marriage to the believing wife? How are the offspring made holy? Well, first Paul says that this is an authorized union between a man and a woman. This is marriage, a husband and a wife who became one flesh in the manner God prescribes. Now, while it's strongly recommended against, it's not necessarily a sin for a believer to marry an unbeliever. And so one possible explanation of why this statement about the sanctification of one spouse gets conferred upon the other, why it's even possible in the eyes of Paul, a rabbi, thoroughly trained in the law, is that he knows that perhaps the holiness of the believing spouse will get transmitted to the other through natural and God-approved contact. And the resulting children, a biological product of this contact, may also contract that holiness. Paul apparently sees this kind of transmission of holiness as a blessing and not a danger. There's yet another possibility as to why Paul believes that this holiness of a believing spouse attaches to the unbelieving one, and then is further transmitted to their offspring. I'm going to need all your concentration towards me for a moment. Partly because this is really complicated. Partly because it is my opinion that this is the best explanation for this very strange and startling principle that Paul is speaking about. We got to go back to our study of tzitzit to understand it. Tzitzit, remember, are tassels that employ an exception to the rule. They are to be made of an otherwise illicit mixture of wool and linen. Yet, they're used to remind people of God's holy commandments, and God commands his people to wear tzitzit. Some parts of priestly garments contained shanetz, an illicit, otherwise illicit mixture, and this too was God ordained. Interestingly, we find that by wearing this mixture of fabrics in the form of a tzitzit, it confers a certain measure of holiness upon the wearer. In fact, it was the new practice of wearing tzitzit that led Korah to tell Moses that all of Israel was holy, not just Moses, not just Aaron, not just the priesthood. Essentially, the product of the mixture of illicit materials in the case of tzitzit is that holiness, to some degree, is conferred upon the wearer. Here we find a similar thing in marriage. The examples Paul gives are essentially an illicit mixture of an unbeliever binding to a believer. But this mixture is acceptable to God if It occurs within the God-ordained institution of human binding called marriage. The marriage is still shonetz, a mixture that's not supposed to occur in God's eyes, yet the product of it is a legal union. Both spouses attain a measure of holiness, and the children are accepted as clean and legitimate. That's thinking. And I'm sure this brief discussion on holiness brings as many questions, and the Lord knows than what I brought up here, and the Lord knows I don't have all the answers to them. I just don't. There's some inscrutable realities here about the full scope of holiness that I just don't know. But what I hope you can see is that holiness is a far greater matter than outward pious behaviors or saying nice things. And that there are very serious spiritual consequences when we misuse and abuse the holy status that we have been granted as a result of our trust in Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus Christ. So we have to guard that holiness. We have to protect it because it's been graciously granted to us. And we need to do it with all of our being, all of our mind and soul and strength. That'll do it for today. Please rise.
Yeshua.